This is really a formidable task to be given at the end of the conference. I'm in the way of lunch and your departure, and I have an impossible task, of course, and I realized that early this morning when I was going through all my notes of the various sessions. If you could all come back tomorrow afternoon, I could probably make a decent fist of it, but I can't manage that, I know, at the moment. I thank everybody here for what I have personally got out of the conference, because I've learned a huge amount from the many varied contributions that we've had. Some of it negative, but an awful lot of it positive. There's been a lot of livestock, whether it's sacred cows or elephants in the room, which have been slaughtered publicly. Not quite enough, there may be some more to go. But I think it's been very useful. And of course, we're all invested in finding Joel's future son-in-law. And we now know it's not just a question of geography. So it's a real issue here, you know. So just to remind you of the practical outcomes that we have planned, and that is that Harriet has been keeping a running record with the idea of producing for each session a relatively brief summary for the website. I think that's the plan. We also have, of course, been filming most of this. Not all, but most, and we're doing interviews, which again will be on the website. So there are those sort of practical takeaways from the conference, but I know that we all will have our own personal reflections, we'll have heard new ideas and maybe new projects and activities that we hadn't heard of before, and I hope we'll, in our own way, take these ideas forward. But I just really want to pick up on one or two things that have been mentioned. As I say, I won't attempt to go through session by session. But we did decide, unusually, because normally it is a straight sort of post-CHOGM conference where we plunge straight in to the Commonwealth at the outset. And the intention for this conference, which was a departure from past practice, was to try and look at the global challenge generally, and then gradually ease ourselves into the particular contributions that the Commonwealth could or perhaps cannot make to sorting out and responding to those challenges. Now, inevitably, given that many of us are from Commonwealth organisations, we got sucked in to wanting to talk about the Commonwealth in any event. But I think it was a useful reminder to us that as an organisation, we don't exist in a bubble. We've always said that we exist in the service of the United Nations and of the world. We say that we have, and I believe we do when we have the opportunity to do it properly, the ability to create consensus. Consensus, I might say, which, whatever its shortcomings as a means of reaching effective decisions and the sort of timescale that might be involved, is, in my view, a much stronger decision as a result than a vote on which you might be on the losing side, and which therefore you may feel no desire to respect. So I am a believer in consensus, and I am a believer in the Commonwealth's role in creating consensus and, as it were, exporting it to the world. I believe we can be a pace setter and the generator of fresh ideas, an incubator of good practice, and we heard some of that in the conference. And I do also believe we have the capacity to reconcile difference because of the nature of the organisation we are, and to both for ourselves, but also perhaps for the world, make contributions like we did on South Africa. But there's no denying that the global view is deeply frightening. We did there was an exchange about whether we should be transfixed by our fear, and that we should concentrate on the nature of the challenge. We didn't talk about the prospect of nuclear war, but we all know that that is something, or nuclear exchanges, which is at the back of our minds, just as some of us will remember those years, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and the periods in the 1980s, when we now know how close we came to nuclear war. So, you know, we know that we are at a very perilous time. We see, just as when the Balkans exploded, we thought that war in Europe was no longer possible, of that barbaric, you know, that sort of deeply medieval barbaric kind. And now we see industrial warfare on something. I mean, surely this must puncture ideas in the UK that we have a global role on our own as a military force, when the Times reported that if we had to fight a war like Ukraine is fighting, our ammunition reserves would be gone in a week. And I hope this has been a salutary lesson, both for European partners, for NATO partners, but also for the UK itself, to shed this, one of the many imperial delusions that still linger, I think. But I do want to say that in that, it was pointed out that I think the UN has been at least creating a space which has been valuable within that war. And the Baltic grain deal was mentioned, what it can do in terms of protecting civil nuclear assets, and the economic dimension too is very important, by also being very clear about principles of the Charter and standing up for that. And I do want to come back to this fact that we in the Commonwealth were not able to get a united view on that resolution. And I think we're a little bit too quick to say, oh, well, you know, there's a history of non-alignment, and every country has its own interests. There are very strong reasons why that group of 9 countries may not have felt they could vote for that resolution. I'm not sure any of that washes, really. I think this was a moment to really stand up for the principles of the UN Charter, but also for the principles of the Commonwealth Charter. And I don't know if any diplomatic effort was invested in trying to bring that into line. I just remind you, and history helps it, you know, helps us see how extraordinary it was, that Sonny Ramphal was able to mobilize on Margaret Thatcher's behalf a huge coalition in support of the United Kingdom in the United Nations for its Falklands, for the reaction to the Falklands invasion in 1982. And, you know, that looking back historically, that was an extraordinary achievement, given all the other, even at that stage, all the other pressures there were. So I really, I think that was a missed opportunity, because I suspect it was entirely missed, given that moment in time when the mind of the Commonwealth was on other things. And I do think it's worthwhile, if we're slaughtering sacred cows or elephants or whatever, I think it's worthwhile just recognizing that we have lost some valuable time, creative working time on the preoccupations with the re-election of the Secretary-General, or an extension of her term, whatever it's now called, and on the unedifying spat, one has to say, which occasionally emerged between the British government in particular, but other governments as well, and the Secretary-General and the Secretariat. Some very unhelpful things were said, and it's the sort of things that bubble up and then given a racial tinge on occasions, which is, you know that the Commonwealth is not working as it should be if that sort of stuff starts coming up. And that has been a distraction, and I think we have to recognise that. And if we carry on doing that, then we won't address the issues that we need to do. Now, there have been many positives nonetheless, and we heard, for instance, in the climate session, there was obviously calls for effective leadership, but Nicholas did tell us much more about the Blue Charter programme, and he described it, I think, as an implementation. I forget the exact phrase, an implementation framework or some such. And I think Sue praised it as well, because for many of us, we hadn't heard something of that detail and of that clarity, even though some of us had searched for it to get something. And I think it really is a programme in partnership with Commonwealth governments, and Joe touched on this too, which I think has huge benefit for a valuable, already making a valuable Commonwealth contribution. And, you know, I think the 2 points I'd say on that. One is that we shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that we are maybe initiating new processes which we ourselves have no prospect of funding. Time and time again, where the Commonwealth has really been useful, it has started with an idea and with very little resources has built up something which inevitably has graduated into the international sphere. And it no longer becomes ours. And that's one of the reasons with our problems with our history and with getting credit for things. Because as we do these things, there are occasions when people say, you know, you must work in discreet and non-public ways. And the Commonwealth is not good about blowing its own trumpet, because there are many other people much better prepared to blow the trumpet for them and to take the credit for them. That's why the history on the Commonwealth's engagement with South Africa is so bad and so patchy, because we have allowed other people to take that history and appropriate it. And that is what happens in terms of so many things that the Commonwealth does. I mean, it's great, you know, we had a great programme on debt back in the 1990s and debt relief. And in the process of that, we had this very long-standing programme on debt management with the software. That has gone out to country after country, not just in the Commonwealth, but to China, to lots of other parts of the world. It continues. It makes a real practical difference, but it has now ceased to be something that is necessarily anyone recognises as, except, you know, something that they take for granted. So I think that's a reality that we have to accept, that all the things that we do will be gradually, if they're any good, they will be taken over by the world. I just want to finish by saying something about the Commonwealth challenge. I do have some trepidation about Samoa. I absolutely accept the argument about equality of region and of country. It's just that we do know that Commonwealth heads have been voting with their feet. And if they don't like a summit, you know, it's absolutely weasel behaviour. But having got the Commonwealth to Colombo with President Rajapaksa, which was such a disastrous decision, a lot of the heads stayed away and voted with their feet. There was, you know, not a good turnout in Kigali. I think one has to accept that. I think it could have been much, much better. What will it be like in Samoa? Well, if it's not a good turnout of heads, then I worry about that. I worry about, you know, this is a consequence of the last few years of what I describe as convention creep, that we've had a perversion of some of the Commonwealth's rules. about whether somebody's serving a term or whether they've started another term, and now this thing about rotation. We know that, we should all know that since the Secretary-General was first elected, there's never been a question that it is by region and rotation. It has always been a question of the best person for the job, regardless of gender. I served an African Secretary-General for 10 years as the head of his office. He was among the best. There's no question of it. But, we limit ourselves if we say, and we stick it in our communique, that the next Secretary-General has to come from Africa alone. I don't know whether this is something all governments will respect, but it's certainly not a rule until somebody put it in the communique. So I worry about that. But my conclusion is, we talk about, I mentioned at the beginning, because Nick challenged us to say, well, what is it? Describe in a sentence what the Commonwealth is or what it can be. And we've all had a go at that. And it's quite a long sentence. But I would want to say those things I said before: the consensus builder, the pace setter, the conflict, intervening in conflicts in a constructive way, the reconciler, the connector, all those things. But none of those things exist unless we're prepared to make them happen. Sometimes we think that because the label's on them and they're on the wall, as it were, then that's all part of our architecture and all part of our attributes. Well, they're not. They're only there if we actually make use of them, if we make use of the potential. And that, I'm afraid, at the moment, is not happening on a very widespread level. But it doesn't mean to say that we don't all the time have the ability to use what I think most of us recognize as an organization of great potential, but which is consistently failing to realize that potential. So, in answer, finally, to Joel's question, what's the point? I would say, well, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Thank you.